The last light of day stretched long and golden across the Wyoming grasslands, a soft hush settling over the plains as the sun lowered itself toward the rim of the earth. Wind moved in slow tides through waist-high grass, brushing the land like a gentle hand, carrying with it the scent of dry sage and the faint tang of wood smoke from a distant homestead. Clara Dawson pressed her forehead to the dusty window of the stagecoach and watched the colors fade from amber to rose. Every mile of open prairie deepened the ache of distance between this place and the tidy Missouri town she had left behind. She held a folded letter in her lap, the paper creased from months of reading. Elias Turner's handwriting, steady, thoughtful, had promised her a life of quiet partnership on a cattle spread just beyond a settlement called Willow Bend. The letter smelled faintly of cedar and dust, as though it had absorbed the prairie air long before she did. Clara ran a gloved thumb along its edge, feeling the words without looking, as if touch alone could steady the tremor of uncertainty that traveled through her. The coach slowed with a jolt, wheels grinding over stones. The driver called out that this was the Turner homestead, his voice a low rumble against the endless evening. Clara stepped down into the cooling air, her skirts brushing the dry earth, and looked around. To the west, the horizon stretched unbroken, a vast ocean of wheat-colored grass bending beneath the breeze. To the east, a cluster of cottonwoods trembled in the fading light, their leaves whispering secrets to one another. The cabin stood modest and alone, smoke absent from its chimney. Its windows caught the sunset like dull coins, and the porch sagged slightly at one end. Clara's heartbeat quickened. She had pictured a welcoming glow, a figure waiting. Instead, the stillness was complete, broken only by the mournful call of a coyote threading through the distant canyons. She knocked once on the rough-hewn door. Silence answered. Another knock, firmer. The latch gave with a soft creak, and she stepped inside. The air smelled of wood ash and the faint sweetness of dried hay. Shadows stretched across the floorboards, long and cool. A narrow bed stood against the far wall, and upon it lay a man. Elias Turner's face, familiar only from the daguerreotype he had sent, was unmistakable. Yet the stillness of him struck her harder than any stranger's gaze could have. His skin held the gray pallor of fever spent, and a damp cloth lay fallen at his side. Clara's breath caught, a small sound in the heavy quiet. She moved closer, her hands trembling as if to straighten the blanket, but stopped when she felt the unmistakable chill. Outside, the coyote called again, softer now, as though offering a hymn. Clara stood motionless, grief rising not from love. How could she love a man she had never met? But from the collapse of promise. All those letters, all those careful hopes, scattered like chaff in a sudden wind. A faint clatter broke the stillness. She turned sharply. Through the doorway's dim light she saw a figure at the corral, a man bending to hammer a rail into place. His movements were deliberate, strong, the kind that came from long familiarity with solitude. He straightened when he sensed her gaze. The resemblance was startling, Elias, and yet not. This man was taller, the lines of his face more weathered. Shadows of stubble caught the last streak of sunlight along his jaw. He stood still, hammer in one hand, eyes dark and unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "You must be Miss Dawson," he said at last, voice low as the prairie wind. She stepped out onto the porch, the letter still clutched in her hand. "I am," she replied, her own voice barely above a whisper. "I found him inside." He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of storm clouds. "I'm Silas, Elias's twin." The word hung between them, carrying both introduction and eulogy. Silas looked toward the cabin, his jaw tightening. "He took sick 3 nights ago. Fever came fast. I sent for the doctor in town, but the storm washed the bridge out. By the time I got back, he let the sentence drift into the evening." Clara lowered her eyes, the weight of the letter suddenly heavier than any stone. "I'm sorry," she said, though the words felt pale and thin against the quiet. Silas nodded once, a gesture of acceptance rather than comfort. He set the hammer aside and leaned against the corral rail, watching the horizon as if gathering strength from the endless line of land and sky. "He spoke of you often," he said finally. "Said you were steady. Someone who understood silence." The prairie deepened into twilight, stars pricking through a dome of velvet blue. Crickets began their patient song, a low chorus that wrapped the cabin and corral in gentle rhythm. Clara felt the night settle around her like a soft shawl. "I don't know what I should do," she admitted. "The coach has gone. There's no other until morning." "You can stay here," Silas said simply. "There's the spare bed in the loft. Tomorrow I'll ride to town, send word to the preacher and the undertaker." He paused, eyes meeting hers, steady and unflinching. "You shouldn't be out on the road after dark." Something in his calm steadiness eased the tightness in her chest. She nodded, grateful for the offer, though the thought of sleeping beneath the same roof as a man she had just met set her heart to a faster beat. Inside, Silas lit a single lantern, its ember glow spilling over the wooden walls. He moved with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire, setting a kettle on the stove. Clara watched from the doorway, her own movements hesitant, like a guest unsure of her welcome. Yet he seemed to need no conversation, and that, somehow, was a kindness. They sat at the small table, the fire's warmth mingling with the scent of steeping tea. Outside, the wind sighed through the cottonwoods, and the stars multiplied until the sky seemed a living thing. Clara unfolded the letter once more, smoothing its worn edges. The words that had once promised a shared future now felt like a bridge to nowhere. Silas noticed but said nothing, only poured her a cup and pushed it gently toward her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the softness of the prairie night. "He wrote that this land was a place to begin again." I believed him. Silas's gaze lingered on the flames. "It still is," he said, the simple statement carrying no persuasion, only quiet fact. They drank in silence, two strangers bound not by choice but by the unrelenting sweep of life on the frontier. Outside, the coyote's song faded into the distance, replaced by the steady rhythm of the wind. Clara felt the loneliness of the plains pressing in and, unexpectedly, the subtle comfort of another heartbeat across the table. The lantern flickered, throwing shifting patterns against the log walls. Silas rose, his movements unhurried. "I'll check the horses," he said, and stepped into the night. Clara watched him go, the door closing softly behind. She held the cooling cup between her palms, staring at the letter's familiar script until the lines blurred. Above the roof, stars wheeled in their patient dance, and the vast Wyoming sky felt both endless and near, as if it might lean down and listen. In that quiet, Clara sensed a truth deeper than grief. The land did not end with loss. It held them both, stranger and widow, twin and traveler, in its wide embrace, inviting them to stand where destiny had paused and simply breathe. Morning arrived with a pale sweep of gold over the plains, light spilling across the cabin's rough floorboards and steering Clara from uneasy dreams. The scent of coffee drifted through the small space, warm and steady, and she followed it to the kitchen where Silas stood by the stove, sleeves rolled past his elbows, the fire painting a quiet glow along his forearms. He glanced up only briefly, offering a slight nod before setting a steaming cup on the table. No words needed. The simple act, like the coffee itself, was enough to start the day. Outside, the prairie woke in a hush of wind and bird call. Silas led her to the porch where a loose rail sagged near the steps. "Storm loosened it last month," he said, passing her a hammer as naturally as if she'd always belonged there. Together they worked in companionable silence, the rhythm of wood and nail blending with the rustle of dry wheat beyond the fence. Clara steadied the rail while he drove each nail clean, the muscles of his shoulders shifting beneath his faded shirt. The closeness was unremarkable and yet not, a quiet acknowledgement that two sets of hands made the work lighter. When the rail held firm, Silas stepped back and wiped his brow. "Better," he said simply. Clara found herself smiling, surprised by the small pride that welled at the sight of the porch standing straight. Dawn deepened into morning. They crossed the field to the cattle pen, dew shining on the tall grass like scattered glass. The animals shifted and snorted softly, steam rising from their backs in the chill. Silas moved with easy certainty, guiding her through the feeding, showing how to scatter grain and check the trough. He spoke little, but when he did his voice carried the calm of a man long at home with silence. Clara matched his pace, learning the small tasks, and felt the weight of her grief settle into something steadier, as if the land itself were lending her strength. Later, in the barn's shadowed cool, he showed her how to hitch the wagon. The leather straps creaked as he lifted them, the horses stamping lightly. "Loop it through here. Keep it flat," he instructed, and his hand brushed hers for a heartbeat as he guided the strap into place. Heat rose to her cheeks, unexpected as a sudden gust of wind, but Silas gave no sign of noticing, his eyes focused on the buckle. By midday the sky blazed a clean, hard blue. They shared a simple meal beneath the lone cottonwood, a slice of bread, a wedge of cheese, water cold from the well. Clara watched the breeze ripple through the wheat, each stalk bowing and rising like the slow breath of the earth. She thought of the letter folded in her pocket and felt its edges soften with every passing hour, the words inside growing less like a tether and more like a memory. The afternoon brought quiet chores, gathering eggs, sweeping the porch, mending a tear in one of Silas's shirts. He handed it over almost reluctantly, the fabric worn thin from years of work. Clara set to stitching, her fingers sure from years of practice. When Silas returned, he examined the neat seam and gave a short, approving nod. "You've got a steadier hand than I ever had," he said. The compliment was simple, but it lingered, warm as the late sun. As evening descended, they carried buckets of water from the well, the sky flushing with soft violets and rose. The air smelled of dust and cooling earth. A faint line of smoke from a neighbor's chimney drew across the horizon, the only sign of other lives in the vast expanse. Clara found comfort in the quiet repetition of their tasks, each moment a thread in a fabric she hadn't known she needed. When the last light faded, they settled on the porch with mugs of coffee, the world around them easing into night. Crickets filled the dark with their patient drone, and far off a coyote called, its note both lonely and familiar. Stars appeared one by one until the sky was a deep river of light. Silas leaned back against the rail they had mended, his gaze lifted upward. "Elias used to say the stars here burn closer than anywhere else," he murmured. Clara followed his eyes. "It does feel that way," she said softly. "Like you could reach up and warm your hands." They let the silence stretch. It wasn't the empty kind she had known in Missouri, the kind that pressed against the ears. This silence breathed, alive with insects and night wind, and she found herself relaxing into it as if it were a familiar quilt. A stray lock of hair slipped from her braid, and she tucked it back, catching the brief flicker of Silas's glance before he looked away. He lifted his tin cup slightly, an unspoken toast, and she returned it with a small smile. No promises passed between them, only the quiet recognition of two souls sharing the same dusk. Before turning in, Clara lingered at the porch's edge, the prairie stretching endless and dark, the cottonwoods whispering in the breeze. She felt the weight of decision somewhere in the distance, but for now it could wait. Tonight there was the sound of wind, the steady presence of another heartbeat nearby, and the slow, patient work of a life beginning to take shape. The night settled deeper, stars wheeling in their silent arcs, and the soft rhythm of crickets carried them both toward sleep, each aware in some quiet corner of the heart that the days of labor had already started to weave something lasting between them. The morning came brittle and bright, sunlight breaking over the plains like shards of pale gold. Clara was gathering eggs in the quiet yard when the distant thud of hooves carried across the grass. A lone rider approached from the east, his figure a dark stitch against the boundless horizon. Dust curled behind him as he slowed at the gate, tipping his hat in greeting. "Post from town," he said, swinging down with the easy grace of a man used to long roads. He handed over a single envelope, its edges smudged from travel, the seal cracked but intact. "Been chasing you a spell. Storm held me up." Clara thanked him and watched the rider turn back toward the open country, his silhouette soon lost in the shimmer of heat. The envelope trembled slightly in her hand. Her name was on the outside, but she knew the handwriting before she even read it. Her own, the letter she had written weeks ago to Elias, full of questions and cautious hope. Inside the cabin, Silas sat at the table, whittling a small piece of pine. He looked up as she entered, eyes settling on the letter with quiet understanding. "That for Elias?" "Yes," she said, the word barely audible. She set it down before him, unsure if she had the right to open what was, in some way, already answered by death. Silas reached for the envelope with deliberate care, as though touching a fragile bird. He read each line silently, his brow softening as the words unfolded. A life she had revealed in ink, her longing for a place to belong, the way she had watched the Missouri River when she missed her parents, the dreams she carried of evenings by a warm fire with the men she could trust. When he finished, he let the paper rest on the table. "He'd have been proud to get this," he said, voice low. "It's honest." Clara felt a warmth rise despite the sorrow. "I wanted him to know who I was before I came." "He would have known," Silas replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "Now I do." The day drifted on with the slow rhythm of chores. They worked side by side in the barn, mending a loose gate and brushing down the horses. A breeze carried the scent of sage through the open doors, mingling with the dust and hay. Their conversation stayed easy, each word measured but never forced. By late afternoon, a second rider appeared, this one heavy-shouldered and watchful, a revolver at his hip. He dismounted with the stiff caution of a man accustomed to danger. "Looking for a fellow goes by Silas Turner," he said, voice hard as gravel. Used to ride with the Coyote Creek gang. Heard he might be here. Clara stiffened, her breath catching like a snag thread. Silas stepped forward, calm as a stone in a river. That was a long time back, he said evenly. I was young, made mistakes. Did my time. Sheriff in Willow Bend has the papers if you care to check. The bounty hunter's eyes narrowed. Some say you skipped out before the rope found you. Silas met the accusation without a flicker. I buried my brother 3 days ago, he said, the quiet weight of the words heavier than any weapon. You can ride to town for the truth, or you can waste your evening here. But there's no bounty left to claim. The men studied him for a long moment, the wind steering the tails of his coat. Finally he spat into the dirt, swung back into the saddle, and turned toward the fading sun. If you're lying, I'll hear of it, he muttered, then rode off, leaving only the fading echo of hooves and the sudden stillness of the prairie. Clara exhaled slowly, her heart easing as the sound disappeared into the horizon. Silas remained motionless for a time, eyes on the distance as if watching more than the raiders' retreat, perhaps the ghost of his own past fading with the light. That evening, the quiet returned like a balm. Clara found him in the tack room, rubbing oil into a worn saddle. She joined him without a word, picking up a rag and helping to smooth the leather. Their hands worked close, brushing now and then, neither of them pulling away. The lantern light pooled around them, golden and soft, carrying the faint scent of linseed and dust. You never asked, he said after a while, his voice low. It wasn't my place, she replied. We all have shadows. Silas glanced at her, something unspoken passing in that look, a gratitude deeper than words. I left that life behind, he said. Been paying it off every day since. Clara nodded, letting the silence speak for them both. The saddle gleamed under their combined care, each stroke a quiet affirmation that the past, though present, did not own the future. Later, after the chores were done and the night spread wide with stars, Silas sat alone by the hearth. The letter lay beside him, its creases catching the firelight. He unfolded it once more, tracing the lines with a calloused thumb. Then, slowly, he reached for paper of his own. The scratch of the pen was soft against the crackle of the flames. He did not write as Elias, there was no comfort in pretending, but as himself, each word measured and plain. He spoke of the days they had spent mending rails and feeding cattle, of the quiet he had come to share with her, of the respect that had grown without demand. He wrote of the prairie sky that stretched endless and forgiving, and of the chance, however fragile, that two lives might lean toward one another without the weight of past promises. When he finished, he left the note folded on the hearthstone where she would find it come morning. Outside, the coyotes sang to the moon, a low, steady chorus that seemed less lonely than before. Silas listened, feeling the night settle like a soft blanket across the plains, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself the small, steady hope that tomorrow might carry more than survival. It might carry the beginning of something quietly, stubbornly good.